Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the Appalachian Mountains. Let us know where you're watching us from now. In the misty mountains of West Virginia, where old forests covered up all signs of civilization, there was an estate that should never have been built. The CROWE mansion looked like a scar on the landscape, with its Gothic towers stabbing the gray sky and its windows staring out over the valley in a way that wasn't normal. This video is a made-up story made just for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Two women came to the remote area of Pocahontas County in 1902, which is where the story begins. People didn't know exactly where they came from, but they did know that they were carrying heavy trunks and a lot of antique jewelry. The CROWE sisters bought 300 acres of untouched land on the darkest mountain slopes, where the sun rarely touched the ground and the fog stayed thick even on the hottest summer days. The hottest days of summer. Eleanor and Constance CROWE did not look like the women who lived in that area at all. They wore lace gloves all the time and black velvet dresses even when it was really hot. They also spoke with an accent that no one could place. Their faces were white as porcelain, almost see-through, and their eyes had a disturbing depth that made the locals look away. They started building the mansion right away. And this is the first mystery about the sisters. They didn't hire any workers from the area. Instead, men came from far away, worked at night, and left before dawn. The noises that came from the property during those months of building were impossible to understand. There was a lot of rhythmic hammering, chanting in languages we didn't know, and sometimes screams that sounded like wolves howling, but they were clearly human. When the mansion was finally done, it was a building that didn't make any sense from an architectural point of view. 3 floors of dark stone with hallways that went nowhere, stairs that led to solid walls and doors that opened into deep, dark spaces. The towers were too big and leaned at strange angles. The main entrance faced north. People in the nearby village of Greenbank started to notice strange changes after the CROWE sisters moved in. The cattle got sick for no apparent reason and developed circular wounds that never healed. This went against all the building traditions of the time. The trees around the property started to die, and their leaves got darker until they were as dark as coal. And then there were the nightly sounds, deep moans that seemed to come from the earth's core, along with the music played on instruments that no one could identify. Eleanor, the oldest sister, was not often seen. She always came to the village at dusk to buy food, and she moved with an unnatural grace, as if her feet barely touched the ground. But Constance were different. She went to the homes of the people who lived nearby and always brought strange gifts. She had vials of dark liquids that she said they were medicines, amulets made of bones and corroded metals, and small mirrors with blackened silver frames. The women in the village talked quietly about Constance's visits. They said she asked strange questions about families, blood ties, and old stories that had been lost. They wanted to know about deaths that couldn't be explained, about madness that ran in families, about secrets that ancestors had buried with them, and always, she asked about the land, what had been there before, and ancient, people who might have lived in those mountains. A merchant from the village who had the guts to bring goods to the CROWE mansion came back changed. For days, he couldn't put together sentences that made sense. When he finally got his speech back, he wouldn't say what he had seen inside the house. He only said that the walls were alive, that the hallways moved, and that there were doors that should not be opened. A week later, he left the village with only the clothes on his back. The seasons came and went. The CROWE mansion, on the other hand, seemed to be outside of time, even though the mountains were covered in snow. The sisters' estate stayed strangely warm, and in the middle of summer, steam rose from its chimneys. The plants around it kept dying, making a perfect circle of desolation that grew slowly, like an infected wound in the ground. There aren't many records from Pocahontas County from that time, and the ones that do exist don't all agree. Some papers say that the CROWE sisters were rich widows from Europe. Some people say they were a family of AES. Some stories even say that they were members of a religious group that the government shut down in another state. We can't be sure about any of these versions. And the more you look into it, the more the story breaks into pieces that don't fit together. We know for sure that the CROWE sisters changed that part of the West Virginia mountains in a big way. The air got thicker and smelled like metal, which burned the nose. The nights got darker, as if even the stars were avoiding that place, and people started to have bad dreams, seeing endless hallways and doors that led to other worlds. The human mind was not meant to understand. The mansion was only the start. The CROWE sisters were building more than just walls and bricks in those mountains. It was something old that had been sleeping under the ground for hundreds of years, waiting for the right time to come back. The people of Greenbank first realized that something really bad was going on in the fall of 1903. The leaves from the trees fell in perfect circles around the CROWE mansion, making spirals that looked like they were coming together at an invisible center. In that area, the wind always blew toward the property in a strange way, as if the house were breathing and pulling in the air around it. Elena started having parties at the mansion every night. Some residents got invitations written in silver ink at their homes. People who had always shown, people who were interested in ancient art, or who had private libraries with rare books. They never said no to the invitations. The way the words moved on the page made it impossible to ignore them. People who went to the meetings came back different. Not in a physical way, but something about their eyes had changed. They talked less, smiled differently, and started spending a lot of time alone, writing in notebooks. They were kept locked up. One woman who went to the meetings a lot started painting disturbing pictures of landscapes that didn't exist, skies of colors that couldn't happen, and horizons that folded back on themselves. At the same time, Constance grew her power in a less obvious way. She helped the people who lived there with things that seemed small, like how to grow vegetables in bad soil, how to understand dreams that kept coming back, and how to deal with memories that didn't seem to belong to their own lives. Her ideas always worked, but they made people feel bad. People thought they had given up something valuable to get that help, but they couldn't say what. Exactly what. The library at CROWE Manor became famous among the few people who were allowed to see it. The circular hall had shelves that went from the floor to the ceiling and were filled with books that were bound in materials other than leather. The books were written in languages that used letters and symbols that hurt the eyes when looked at for too long. Elena spent whole days in that library copying old texts and writing notes in the margins that looked like they were bleeding black ink. A professor who travels, who went to the mansion to make a list of rare books and left with a story he only told once before leaving the area for good. He said there was a huge map on the wall of one of the upper rooms that showed the Appalachian Mountains in incredible detail. The map showed underground buildings, caves that aren't in any geological record, and marks at certain points that made a disturbing geometric pattern when connected. The sisters were either looking for something or getting ready for something. The oldest. People started to remember stories their grandparents told them about the first settlers who came to that area and found signs of a civilization that had been there before. Not the native peoples we know, but something older. Stone buildings buried deep in the ground with writing on them that no one could read. In the winter of that year, odd lights started to show up in the mansion. Not the steady yellow of candles or the orange glow of lanterns, but bluish and green lights that pulsed in time with each other. In the windows of the tower, the lights would sometimes make patterns, like a visual language, that repeated themselves. People who watched them for too long said they had terrible headaches and saw endless hallways. Constance started going on trips into the mountains, always with men who had been to Appalachian's meetings. They had tools for digging and metal tools whose purpose was unknown. They would come back days later, covered in stone dust and looking far away. No one talked about what they had found, but knew. Carved symbols started to show up on the trees around the property. These markings looked like they were giving directions or marking off areas. The mansion didn't actually grow, but its presence did. Even when they were miles away, the residents could feel its weight. There was a constant pressure at the base of their skulls and a feeling that they were being watched. The mirrors in the village houses started to show reflections that were a little bit late, as if the image had to travel a long way before it could form. The glass. In the early morning, Elelonina got into the habit of walking around the edges of her property. She would walk around the edge in a set pattern, stopping at certain points to draw symbols in the air with her fingers while wearing all black. As her fingers moved through the air, it seemed to tear for a moment, showing a darkness that was too deep to be natural before closing again. The nightly meetings happened more often and were stranger. There was music coming from the mansion, but it wasn't being played by traditional instruments. They were sounds that seemed to come from strings that were too tight, metals that were vibrating at frequencies that made your bones ache, and many voices singing in harmonies that didn't follow any known musical scale. A blacksmith in the village who stayed away from the mansion started getting strange orders from Constance. She wanted dozens of keys made of certain metals and in certain shapes that she drew on yellowed paper. The keys didn't go into normal locks. Some of them were too big or too small, and their teeth made fractal patterns that couldn't be exactly copied. The blacksmith did his best, though, and Constance always smiled when she got his work, even though it didn't reach her eyes. In the spring of 1904, things changed in small but clear ways. The dead plants around the mansion had spread out to a radius of almost 500 meters. There was no growth there, not even moss or fungi. The dirt was now gray and thin, like ash from a volcano. And in that circle of sadness, the CROWE mansion looked more solid and real than any other building nearby, as if it were becoming more real while everything else faded away. It was rare to see the sisters together now. When they came to the village, they came one at a time, each with their own secret plans. Elelonina looked for old papers, lost maps, and any other records that talked about the mountain's history before they were colonized. Constance took personal things from the villages, always giving something back. But the things she took weren't important. A piece of stained fabric, an old button, and a piece of a letter. It was like she was putting together a puzzle that no one could see. After that, the group dreams started. People who had never talked to each other before had the same dreams. Stone hallways lit up by that blue light that pulsed. Doors that opened onto empty spaces where people whispered, and always the feeling that something was coming up from the depths, something that had been waiting a long time to come back. Summer had come to the mountains of West Virginia, and the heat was so bad that it seemed to be focused on the property of the CROWE sister. The air above the mansion shimmered, as if time there were a little off from the rest of the world. The birds had left the area for good, and even the bugs stayed away from the dead property. It was time for Elelonina to add to her collection. She started going to other parts of the mountains, always, coming back with locked chests that the men who came to her parties carried inside the mansion. People who were nearby when the chests were being moved said they heard whispers coming from inside, as if the things inside had their own voice. The bond between the two sisters started to weaken. People who lived near the mansion at night sometimes heard loud fights. People outside could hear Elelonina and Constance's voices through the open windows, debating the best ways, times, and risks that one person thought were okay and the other person was afraid of. Constance wanted to speed up her plans, but Elelenar insisted on doing the rituals exactly as they were supposed to be done. Around this time, the mansion started to show properties that were truly impossible. People who came said that the hallways got longer or shorter depending on the time of day. In the morning, a door that led to the library might open onto an empty hall in the afternoon. Staircases that went up 3 stories by counting the steps ended only 2 floors up. The house's architecture seemed to be alive, always changing shape according to some secret geometry. Constance made her trips into the mountain caves more intense. She was obsessed with a certain set of tunnels that ran through the steepest parts of Pocahontas County. The old maps Elelenar had gotten showed that those tunnels were much bigger than any modern explorer thought. They went for miles under the surface and connected points that made that. A geometric pattern that makes you feel uneasy. The men who went with Constance on these trips came back changed in small but disturbing ways. It looked like they were dancing instead of walking because their movements were so smooth. They spoke in strange rhythms, stopping at odd places in their sentences, and their eyes reflected light in a way that made them look green, even in complete darkness. For her part, Elelenar turned the 3rd floor of the mansion into something that can't be put into words. Those few visitors. People who went up there found a room that looked bigger on the inside than the outside of the building. There were symbols all over the walls that she had been copying for years, and they were arranged in complicated mathematical patterns. There was a round structure in the middle of the main hall made of different metals that were woven together in patterns that hurt the eyes when looked at directly. Things were getting tense in the village of Greenbank. People started to stay away from the CROWE mansion, even from a distance, because people believed that looking at the property's towers would give them nightmares for 3 nights in a row. And it was true. People who looked dreamed of those stone hallways, but now they could hear footsteps behind them, and something was coming through the dark. On a very hot night in August, all of the mansion's windows lit up at once. Not the soft light from before, but a bright light that made the whole area look like it was midday. The event only lasted a few seconds, but it left permanent marks. Some trees near the mansion were permanently bent away from it, as if an unseen force had pushed them. People who looked directly at the light lost their ability to see colors for a few days, seeing the world in shades of gray instead. That night, Constance was different when she woke up. Her movements were even stranger now, as if she were only partially there and some of her essence was somewhere else. She started talking about the convergence, a word she used all the time but never fully explained. She said that the lines were coming together, that the portals were becoming open, and that what was below would soon be above. Elelenar looked worried about how her sister had changed, but she was too busy getting ready for her own things. The 3rd floor drawing room started to make a constant low-frequency hum that was so deep that it could be felt more than heard. People who went to the mansion said that the shadows on that floor acted strangely, moving ahead of or behind their bodies. The nightly meeting stopped all of a sudden. Ellen said that the preparation phase was over and that everyone should now work alone. The men who had been to the meetings were sent home, but they kept patrolling the property like silent guards. They didn't sleep anymore. Instead, they stayed awake in shifts, watching the mountains around them as if they were waiting for something to happen. The fall of 1904 brought fogs that were thicker than usual. The mountains were always shrouded in a mist that seemed to come from the CROWE estate and spread out like ghostly fingers. Sounds moved in strange ways through this fog. Voices could be heard clearly for miles, but screams that were only a few meters away were muffled into silence. Constance started to hold her own ceremonies in the caves. Now she would go down into the tunnels by herself, carrying lanterns that burned with that blue flame. She would stay down there for days at a time, coming up covered in stone dust and speaking in languages that no one knew belonged to any known language family. Her hands started to show strange marks, scars and geometric patterns that looked like they were carved from the inside out. The mansion responded to what Constance was doing underground. While she was in the caves, the building above shook a little, and the vibrations in its foundations made her teeth hurt. It felt like there was something more than just a connection between the house and the tunnels. Being close to each other, as if they were all parts of the same huge dormant organism. Elelena finally finished the metal frame on the 3rd floor. It was a ring about 3 meters wide that hung straight down from the ceiling by wires that were so thin they were almost invisible. The metals that made it up were put together in a certain order, with each one matching a symbol on the walls around it. When light hit the ring at certain angles, it made shadows that made those same strange geometric shapes on the maps. People in Greenbank started to think about leaving the village. The CROWE mansion was too much to handle. Even people who had never been near the property felt its weight, which was always there, and made it hard to sleep and impossible to dream. But they stayed for some reason. A strange kind of inertia that made it seem both urgent and impossible to leave. And then the storms came. Not regular fall storms, but weather events that seemed to only affect the CROWE. House. Lightning hit the property in circles, but never directly hit the building. Instead, it lit it up with a hypnotic frequency. The thunder echoed with strange harmonics, with notes that overlapped in ways that no natural event should. The CROWE sisters were getting closer to something they had been planning since they got to those mountains. The mountains themselves seemed to be waking up after 1,000 years of sleep and getting ready to see what was about to come out of the depths of stone and time. That year, winter came early, and the cold that came with it felt strange, even for the Appalachian mountains. Snow fell in spirals around the CROWE mansion. It never piled up on the property itself, but it did make white walls around the outside of the house. It was like the house was in an invisible bubble that kept even the weather away. Elelena was no longer the same person she used to be. She spent whole weeks locked up on the 3rd floor, coming out, only to get more old books from her library. Her skin had turned a pale color that was almost see-through, and when she spoke, her voice echoed in a strange way, as if it were coming from a long way away. The few people who still saw her said that sometimes she looked a little blurry, like a picture that hadn't been developed well. Constance, on the other hand, had become more and more present in the real world, but in ways that were upsetting. She started going to the village more often, always bringing small gifts that no one could say no to. Metal things with those strange symbols on them, crystals that glowed at night, and mirrors that showed reflections that weren't quite right. The men who had worked for the sisters started to build something at the edge of the property. They were stone pillars that were about 2 meters tall and spaced out evenly around the circle of dead plants. The pillars were made of a dark stone that didn't match any of the rocks in the area and had been brought from the depths of the caves that Constance kept going back to. Each pillar had symbols carved into it that looked like they changed when no one was looking at them. The markings stayed still if someone looked at them, but as soon as the gaze changed, there was a sense of movement in the peripheral vision, as if the symbols were dancing and changing shape when no one was looking. The metal structure on the 3rd floor of the mansion started to show more and more impossible properties. The air in the ring had become thick and sticky, moving slowly like honey. Things that were thrown through the ring came out on the other side with different temperatures, or were covered in ice, or were burning with a cold that wasn't quite temperature but something deeper. And sometimes, for a split second, you could see something through the ring. Not a shadow or a reflection, but flashes of places that shouldn't be there. Elelena started holding nightly vigils next to the building. She would stay. not moving for hours, staring at the ring with an intensity that was almost trance-like. The low-frequency hum coming from the third floor got louder during these vigils, making the window panes shake and making anyone who got close to the mansion feel sick. Constance went even further into the caves. She had discovered something deep down, a room that wasn't on any of her maps. The walls of the chamber were covered in the same symbols that are now on the mansion, and the pillars made of stone. There was a hole in the ground in the middle of the room that looked like a dry well. It went down so deep that her lanterns couldn't reach it. The dreams that haunted the people of Greenbank had changed. They weren't just hallways and doors anymore. They were visions of something huge moving in the depths. Something with many faces or no face at all, or a face that was everywhere at once. People woke up with the strong feeling that something had been watching them, existed in ways that the human mind couldn't understand. Eleanina finally came down from the third floor in January 1905 to make an announcement. The convergence was close. The stars were in the right places. The lines of force in the mountains had reached their perfect shape, and the doors between the worlds were starting to let things through. She talked about these things with complete confidence, as if she were reading from a text that was written in the air. Constance started getting ready for the last time. She set up, the men into groups, each in charge of one of the stone pillars. She taught them complicated rituals that required them to walk in certain ways, touch symbols in certain orders, and chant sounds that weren't quite words, but were more basic and primitive. The mansion reacted to the preparations with more and more strange things happening. Shadows moved without the light that made them. Footsteps echoed in rooms that were empty. And the doors, those never-ending. During the night, doors that led to impossible places began to open on their own. Instead of rooms or hallways, they opened up to dark abysses that pulsed and gave off a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The mirrors that Constance had given out over the years and put all over the village started to show things that weren't there. There were blurry shapes moving in the reflections. They could have been people, or things that looked like people. People started to cover their mirrors with cloths, but even then they thought they were being watched through the glass that was covered. Eleanor finished a long list of difficult calculations that had taken her years to do. She covered whole walls with equations that combined regular math with symbols that weren't part of any known number system. The equations showed how space curved, how reality folded, and where the membrane between worlds was thinnest and could be broken through with the right tools. At first, the metal structure on the third floor started to slowly spin. Slowly but surely getting faster. It spun without any visible means and was held in the air by forces that went against Newton's laws of motion. As it spun, the air inside the ring got darker, not because there was no light, but because there was something deeper than darkness. Constance went down into the caves one last time. She brought with her things she had taken from Eleanina's locked chests. This time, no one followed her. She went by herself, going down tunnels that got smaller and smaller until she got there. Round room with a well in the middle. And there, deep in the mountains, she did her own ritual. She put the things in certain places around the well and chanted words that echoed for miles through solid stone. When the rituals really started, the people of Greenbank could feel it. It was like the air pressure had suddenly changed, which made eardrums burst and people feel confused. Even during the day, the sky above the mountains looked greenish, and the stars at. It looked like the stars were in the wrong places at night, making constellations that no one could figure out. The stone pillars started to glow with that blue light that is so typical of them, and they pulsed in perfect time with each other. The light moved from one pillar to the next in waves that got faster and faster as they went around the property. And in the middle of that pulsing circle of light, the CROWE mansion looked like it was becoming more real and solid, while everything else around it looked less real. Elelenina stood in front of thee. As she recited passages from the ancient texts she had spent years studying, her hands reached out toward the ring in the rotating structure. The structure spun faster and faster, and the air inside the ring became completely opaque, like a solid darkness that felt heavy and real. And then something started to answer. From the dark caves where Constance did her ritual, from the top of the third floor where Elelenina called on ancient powers, and from places even deeper and more, something was waking up. Something that had been waiting for a long time, and the CROWE sisters had finally given the keys to set it free. There was no moon that night when everything came together. Astronomical records said there should have been a full moon, but the sky was pitch black, with no stars to light up the mountains. It was as if the universe had just turned off its light in that part of West Virginia. Only the glowing light of the stone pillars could be seen in the pitch blackness. Elelenina stayed on the third floor, and her body was completely still in front of the spinning structure. She had become almost see-through, as if her body was slowly turning into something more spiritual. But her voice kept echoing, saying things in languages that sounded older than humans, words that had the weight of ages that had been lost. Constance had deep inside the caves, got to a similar point of change. She sat on the edge of the round shaft, staring down into the void below. Sounds came out of her mouth that were beyond any normal language. They were just frequencies, vibrations that made the stone itself sing and resonate in harmony. The walls of the room started to glow with those old symbols, as if they were being lit up from the inside by a light source that couldn't exist. The men around the pillars kept doing their rituals, and the patterns they made got more and more complicated. They didn't seem fully aware of themselves anymore. Their bodies were doing things that had been programmed into them at a level deeper than rational thought. Their shadows stretched in ways that didn't make sense in physics, reaching toward the mansion like fingers trying to connect in the middle of that sacred geometry. The metal structure on the third floor spun so fast that it should have broken, but it stayed perfectly intact because of forces that didn't follow the usual laws of matter. The air in the ring had turned into something else entirely. It was a substance that was between states. It wasn't a solid, a liquid, or a gas, but it was all of these things at the same time, and through this impossible thing, shapes began to appear. It was impossible to describe these shapes in human language. They were geometries that bent back on themselves and angles that pointed in ways that don't exist in normal three-dimensional space. Seeing them made me feel very disorientation, a sense that perception itself was being stretched to include dimensions that the human mind could not normally handle. In the depths of the caves, Constance started to chant something. It wasn't singing or laughing. It was a sound that showed complete understanding. It was the sound of someone who had finally seen through the veil of everyday life and understood patterns that had been hidden for a long time. Her voice echoed through the tunnels, mixing with the sounds Eleanor made above, and together they made a harmony that made reality itself vibrate at new frequencies. The well in the depths started to respond. Something was coming up from those deep, dark places, something that had been asleep since before the mountains were built. It didn't rise quickly, but it did so in a way that was inevitable in the long run, like tectonic plates moving after thousands of years of pressure. As it rose, it brought with it echoes of times long gone, bits of information that were never written down because there were no minds ready to take them in. Elena could feel the change in the air. The spinning structure had turned into a door, not just a door between places, but also between states of being. What was on the other side wasn't just another place. It was a whole new way of being. It was a place where the rules that govern matter and energy were very different, and where consciousness and substance mixed in ways that couldn't be put into any of the usual categories. People in Greenbank could feel all of this happening. People who had tried to ignore the CROWE mansion by covering their mirrors and drawing their curtains still couldn't shake the feeling that something big was happening. It felt like the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart, about to show layers of existence that are usually hidden. The mansion started to make a noise that didn't come from the windows or chimneys. Instead, it came from the building itself, as if every brick and beam were vibrating at the same frequency. The sound was so deep that it was felt more than heard, going all the way to the bones and making the blood pulse in strange ways. There was a call, a summons, and something was responding from many places at once. The stone pillars got brighter and brighter until they were almost blinding. The light they gave off was no longer blue. It had turned into a rainbow of colors that were beyond what most people could see. They were shades that were between colors that were already known, taking up space in the visual spectrum that should never have been able to be reached. When I looked at them, I had a strange synesthesia where colors made sounds and sounds had real textures. Constance finally got out of the well. The geometric shapes on her hands glowed with the same impossible light as the pillars. She started to climb back up through the tunnels, but the way she moved had changed completely. It was as if she were gliding over the rocks and walking through the tunnels at the same time, existing in more than one place at once. As she made her way back to the surface, Elelenina reached out to the spinning structure, and her fingers, which should have been torn apart by the spin, went through the metal without any trouble. She touched that impossible thing inside the ring, and when she did, something very important changed. The third floor of the mansion was no longer on the same level of existence as the rest of the world. It had become a liminal space, partly here and partly in other dimensions. The men around At the same time, the pillars stopped moving in their usual way. They stood still like statues that were alive. They looked at the mansion with an intensity that went beyond just paying attention, and through those eyes, something was watching. They had turned into windows through which a huge and old mind could finally see this world. The convergence was over. The lines of force in the mountains, the way the stars are lined up, and the rituals that happen at the same time above and below the earth. Everyone had come together in a moment of pure potential. The portal was open not just between places, but also between ways of being and realities that should have stayed apart forever by invisible walls. When Elelenina touched the center of the spinning structure, Constance came out of the caves. At that exact moment, the two sisters were completely in sync and shared the same mind. They could see what the other person was seeing, feel what the other person was thinking, and finally understand. The whole range of what they had done. It was deeply satisfying to have moved pieces across time and space to get to this one moment of endless possibility. The CROWE mansion throbbed like a beating heart. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and with each pulse, waves of changed reality spread from the towers, moving across the mountains and changing everything they touched in small ways. Trees that had been dormant began to grow again, but in strange ways. Their roots grew up and their branches grew out, branches going through the ground. The snow on the ground started to fall up, going back to the sky where it had come from. And something started to come through the rotating structure, through the portal that the CROWE sisters had worked for years to open. It didn't all come through at once, but slowly and carefully, like something huge trying to get through a small opening. It was patient. This being, force, or consciousness that was coming had been waiting a long time. It could wait a few more seconds to make sure the change was full and steady. The CROWE sisters stayed where they were. Eleanor above and Constance below, keeping the portal open with the strength of their wills. They were the bridge's human pillars, holding it up between worlds. They could feel their essences changing to power the portal, but they didn't hesitate. This was the reason they had lived, the moment that made every choice they had made on their journeys worthwhile. What came through the portal that? We can't use words to describe night because that's not what language was made for. It wasn't a normal creature or a pure force. It was something that existed between consciousness and matter. It was like a thought had become real, or like real things had learned to think in ways that went beyond biological thinking. Elena felt the presence completely cross over into this world. Her eyes were glowing with that greenish light that is so typical of her. In the air, where no one else could see it, she saw lines of force moving around, probabilities folding and unfolding, and the very structure of space changing to make room for something that shouldn't fit into the normal 3 dimensions. As the transformation was finishing, Constance climbed the last steps of the caves and came out onto the surface. She could tell that something had changed at its core. The mountains were more than just mountains now. The mansion was more than just a building made of wood and stone. Everything had become part of a bigger shape, a structure that went beyond dimensions that people had not yet named. The men around the pillars started to move again, but this time they moved in a different way. They did dance, if you can call it that. Their movements followed complicated math patterns, leaving behind glowing symbols in the air that stayed there for a few seconds after their bodies passed. And through these bright symbols, you could see other places and other realities that were only briefly overlapping with. This one. The CROWE mansion had changed completely, not in how it looked on the outside, which stayed mostly the same, but in its very nature. It was now present in several layers of reality at the same time, with each floor taking up a slightly different space in the dimensional spectrum. You could go in through the main door and come out in a completely different part of the building, depending on how you approached it. Elena came down from the 3rd floor, or at least a version of it. She did. People who saw her later said that her descent was strange, as if she were taking steps that didn't quite match the steps of the stairs. She moved around the room in ways that made it seem like there were more paths open to her than what you could see with the naked eye. Constance found her in the big main hall of the mansion. It was the first time the 2 sisters had stood face to face since the rituals started. They didn't say anything out loud, but something passed between them. Communication that happened on levels other than speech. They now had a shared understanding that came from their connection with whatever had come through the portal. People who lived in Greenbank watched from a distance. They couldn't get close, but they also couldn't look away. The mansion had become hypnotic, not because anyone forced anyone to look at it, but because it was so strange that it completely held their attention. It was like seeing something that couldn't happen in geometry, something that shouldn't have been there, but it was, going against everything we thought we knew about how the world worked. The structure on the 3rd floor kept spinning, but now it was doing so in more than one direction at once. It had turned into something more complicated than a simple ring with facets and angles that changed depending on where the viewer was standing. And through these changing parts, you could see other places. Not places that were far away from Earth, but places that were completely different ways that space and time can be set up. Eleanor started to look into these new options. She found out that she could get around the mansion in ways that didn't make sense with how it was built. A step through a normal door might not take her to the next room, but to a space that was only partly in this dimension. She walked down hallways that seemed to go on forever in impossible directions. Every step took her deeper into a structure that went beyond all forms of Euclidean geometry. Constance, focused on the caves. She could feel that the depths of the mountains had changed into something much bigger now that the portal was open. The tunnels were no longer just holes in solid rock. they were pathways between different states of being. She could go down through them and come out in places that were still technically beneath the mountains of West Virginia, but they were in completely different realities. The stone pillars had become permanently glowing, pulsing with that light that now looked like it was part of the scenery. They were no longer just signs that a ritual was over, they had become anchors, fixed points that kept this part of reality connected to the other dimensions that the portal had opened. The trees on the property started to grow in strange ways. They not only grew into shapes that seemed impossible, but they also grew through more than one dimension at the same time. One tree's roots might reach down into regular soil, while its branches might reach through areas that weren't quite part of. This reality, and patterns that looked like symbols on the walls of the mansion and in the caves below, started to show up on their trunks. Elelonena brought together everyone who had taken part in the rituals. She had something to tell them, something she had learned by opening the portal. She talked about the nature of reality and how what people thought was a solid, fixed world was really just a thin layer over unfathomable depths. She said that there were an infinite number of interconnected dimensions, each one working, under slightly different laws. Now, thanks to the work of the CROWE sisters, this place had become a meeting point. The men listened with an understanding that went beyond just knowing what was being said. The rituals had changed them. Their minds grew in ways that let them understand ideas that are usually too hard for people to understand. They could picture the different shapes that Eleanor talked about. They could feel the forces moving through them, through the points where the dimensions meet. In the meantime, Constance had found something deep down. There was a room that was even deeper than the one with the main shaft, a place that was only open after the portal was opened. She found records in this room that weren't written down or carved into stone. Instead, they were imprinted on the very fabric of space. They were memories of cultures that lived here long before people did, people who had figured out that reality is multidimensional and had built things that went beyond physical space. Eleanor and Constance met again in the main hall to talk about what they had found. They figured out that the CROWE mansion wasn't just something they made, but something they rebuilt. They had built a structure that had been there before on this site, maybe without even knowing it, using information from old texts. Long ago, civilizations built portals here that let people travel between dimensions. The CROWE sisters had just reopened something that had been closed for a long time. Night began to get brighter, but the sun that rose was not the same one that had set. Or maybe it was the same sun, but seen through a few different layers of reality. The light it cast was strange. It showed textures on surfaces that would normally stay hidden and made shadows that pointed in ways that didn't quite match where the light source was. The CROWE mansion had become one of a kind in the world. It was a place where the lines between dimensions were blurry and where reality was more flexible and changeable. The CROWE sisters had changed so much because of their work that they had become the protectors of this impossible place and the guides through a geography that went far beyond the real mountains of West Virginia. The days after the portal opened brought changes that spread like ripples on a calm lake. The CROWE sisters' estate had become a center for strange events that didn't make sense. Time seemed to move differently inside the mansion, with moments lasting forever, while hours went by in an instant. Elelonena mostly lived on the third floor, where the rotating structure kept dancing all the time. She had learned how to read the patterns that came out of the portal and understand the strange shapes that appeared as if they were a complicated language. She started to map the nearby dimensions through this reading, making diagrams that covered the walls with pictures of spaces that don't exist in normal geometry. Constance turned into a deep-sea explorer. For weeks, she explored the vast caves, finding rooms that only those who knew how to bend their perception through the dimensional layers could see. Each new room had pieces of that old knowledge in it, impressions left by civilizations that understood things about reality that modern people don't even know about. The men who took part in the rituals started to gain their own strange powers. Some found out they could see a little bit into the future, hearing echoes of events that hadn't fully formed in the timeline yet. People could feel the dimensional currents flowing through the property and use them to move in ways that seemed to go against the laws of physics. People from all over the world started to come to the mansion. People who had noticed that the structure of reality had changed, and that something basic had changed in the West Virginia mountains. They came looking for answers or looking for change, or just trying to make sense of what their new, broader views were showing them. Elelena welcomed these guests with an unusual amount of hospitality. She took them through the mansion's changing hallways, giving them glimpses of other dimensions, and letting their minds grow to include things they had never thought of before. Some visitors left changed, taking pieces of this new understanding with them. Others decided to stay and join the growing community that formed around the CROWE sisters. Constance set up regular trips to the deepest rooms. She led small groups of explorers and taught them how to change the way they saw things so they could get around in the spaces between dimensions. They found things in the depths that weren't made of normal matter, things that could be in more than one state at the same time, changing shape and purpose based on how they were looked at. The mansion's new presence slowly changed the village of Greenbank. The people who lived there began to understand that their own views had changed in small ways. They could sometimes see past the surfaces of things and see the energy flows that were going through things that looked like they were dead. Some people learned to tell when someone was about to arrive by feeling the ripples in probability before things happened. Elelena started writing down everything she learned. She made libraries inside of libraries, little rooms that seemed small but held a lot of books. Not only recorded words, but also full, multidimensional experiences. People who read these books not only learned about the ideas in them, but they also got to experience parts of the real worlds that Eleanor had explored. The rotating structure on the third floor had changed. It was no longer just a static portal. It had become something that moved and responded. It changed its properties based on who was looking at it, showing different parts of the adjacent dimensions. Was looking. For some, it showed landscapes of beauty that were hard to understand. For some, it showed pure shapes that didn't have any physical form. Scientists found that the caves were part of a much larger network than they had first thought. Not only were they tunnels under the mountains of West Virginia, but they were also points in a dimensional web that stretched across the whole Appalachian region. There were other places where the lines between dimensions crossed, too. Naturally, thinner. Now that the main portal was open, all of these points were coming back to life. The stone pillars around the property started to vibrate with each other, forming a communication network that worked at frequencies that went beyond physical sound. This network let information move not only through space, but also through the layers of space themselves. Eleanor could send thoughts to Constance deep inside the caves right away, and Constance could send back pictures from chambers that were there, miles below the ground. People who stayed in the mansion long enough started to make their own connections to the dimensional network. They found that they could feel the presence of other people who had gone through the same changes, even from a long way away. It was like everyone who came into contact with the CROWE Mansion's changed reality became part of a distributed consciousness, keeping their own identity but sharing something deeper. Elelena and Constance finally understood that the work they had started was far from done. The first thing to do was open the portal. Now they had to make the connection stable by building structures that would let the dimensional flow keep going in a controlled way. The mansion needed to be more than just a portal. It needed to be a beacon, a place where people could go to find their way through the tangled web of realities. In the spring of 1906, flowers that couldn't grow appeared. Plants that shouldn't be there started to grow on the land. Hybrids between species from different dimensions there. Roots that are partly in this world and partly in others. These plants made fruits with amazing properties that could temporarily change how people saw things, letting them see normally hidden dimensional layers. Constance built gardens in the underground chambers, where they grew these impossible plants in places where normal sunlight couldn't reach them. They grew by using forms of energy that flowed through cracks in space and time. Traits that combined the natural with the mathematical, the living with the purely mathematical. Eleanor made what she called contemplation rooms, which were special areas in the mansion that were meant to help people see more dimensions. Each room was set up with exact angles and proportions that matched the frequencies of nearby dimensions. Being in these rooms let consciousness move easily between different levels of reality, letting it explore without the risk of getting completely lost in many different kinds of problems. The community around the mansion grew on its own. There was no official recruitment, but people who were naturally sensitive to changes in reality found their way there. A strange society formed that was made up of people who had gone beyond the limits of what most people could see and do. They could see and interact with parts of reality that most people couldn't. Months went by, but time had become something that could be changed in the CROWE mansion. Days could feel like they lasted forever. Weeks could go by in a flash, while weeks could go by in a flash. The sisters had learned how to move through time like others move through space, deciding when to speed up and slow down their experience of the flow of time. And through it all, the spinning structure kept dancing, the beating heart of the change that had swept through that part of the mountains. It was the center of all the other changes, the point that stays the same in a sea of realities that change. The door that was always open to possibilities that went beyond what most people thought was real and what was possible. As the seasons changed around the CROWE mansion, people outside of the mansion started to hear about strange things happening deep in the West Virginia mountains. People who traveled told stories about a house where the laws of nature didn't work right, and where the impossible happened all the time. Some people thought these stories were made up or exaggerated, but others thought the words rang true, and went out to find that amazing place. Eleanor had made what she called resonant pathways, which were special paths through the mansion that made it easy to move between different dimensional states. To follow these paths, you had to be very aware of the frequencies that were all around the building. However, those who learned the technique found that they could move through the mansion in ways that completely went against its apparent architecture. It looked like the hallway was 10 meters long, but it could be crossed in 3 steps or 300, depending on which resonant pathway one decided to take. Constance came out of one of her deepest explorations with a discovery that would change everything once more. She had found what looked like a map in the cave's most remote rooms. Not a map of real places, but a map of connections between different dimensions that cover the whole continent. There were other places, like the CROWE mansion, where the lines between things were naturally thin. And now that the main door was open, the points were also starting to wake up. The two sisters met in the big hall to talk about what it meant. If other points were waking up, it meant that the change they had started was not limited to the West Virginia mountains. It was a change that could reach whole regions and reconnect an ancient network that had been lost for thousands of years. Eleanor thought they needed to talk to these other places of awakening. She started to figure out how to use the rotating structure as a kind of dimensional antenna to help her see things that were outside of the property's immediate boundaries. By carefully changing the resonance frequencies, she was able to pick up echoes of similar activity from far away, pulses of dimensional energy that suggested that other people were working on the same boundaries between worlds. Constance went back to the caves with a new goal. If the map was right, the points were connected by tunnels, paths that were there, partly in this dimension and partly in other ones. Finding and opening these paths would make it possible to talk to each other and travel directly between the points where they meet. You could cross continents and steps by taking dimensional shortcuts that didn't take into account how far apart things were. People in the community that had grown up around the mansion started to focus on certain things. Some became seagraphers of dimensions, mapping the flows and meetings of energy that moved through the layers of reality. Some people became cultivators, working with plants that were hard to grow to create new types that could grow well in certain dimensional settings. Some people became architects and learned how to design buildings that could exist in more than one dimension at the same time. Elena set up what she called a circle of observers, a group whose job it was to keep an eye on changes in dimensional boundaries. They took turns working and always kept an eye on the patterns that were forming in the rotating structure. When they noticed something, they would let everyone else know. Big changes in the currents, or when new paths opened up on their own. It was work that needed constant attention and a keen sense of the subtleties of vibrations in 3 dimensions. Constance finally got one of the tunnels on the map to open. It took months of careful work to change frequencies and line up geometries, but eventually the path became clear. It was a passage that went through both the real rock of the mountains and bends in space itself. Going in at one end of the caverns under the CROWE mansion led to a place that was physically hundreds of kilometers away, but dimensionally close. The first group to go through the tunnel came back with amazing stories. They had found another dimensional intersection point, an old building that was partly buried in the thick forests of a different mountainous area. The structure was waking up and responding to the CROWE mansion being turned on, starting to show its own impossible traits. And there were people there, people who had come to the awakening for the same reasons that others had come to the CROWE mansion. Elena realized they were seeing something old come back to life. The dimensional network that long-lost civilizations had built was coming back to life, one node and path at a time. The CROWE sisters didn't make anything new, they just brought something back to life that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The people who came to the mansion now were from farther and farther away, following dreams or gut feelings that led them to the center of the change. Each visitor had their own stories to tell and their own views on the changes that were happening all over the world without anyone saying anything. They started to put together a more complete picture of how big the network was and how deep the changes were that were happening. Constance set up regular trips through the dimensional tunnels, which took groups to other intersection points to explore. That were waking up. Every point was different, with its own set of dimensional forces and how they worked together. Some were better for certain kinds of dimensional work, while others let you see different parts of nearby realities. Elena started to teach what she had learned in a formal way. She held sessions in which she taught people how to expand their perception, how to safely navigate dimensional currents, and the basic rules that govern how different layers of reality interact with each other. Real life. Her students were eager to learn this information, and each came up with their own way to use the powers they now had. The mansion kept changing. New rooms appeared out of nowhere, in places where solid walls had once stood. Each room was set up in a way that made it easier to do certain kinds of dimensional work. It felt like the building was alive and changing to meet the needs of the people who lived there, always rearranging itself to better serve its purpose. The community that is getting bigger. The stone pillars around the property had become real beacons. People could now see their light from much farther away, not always with their eyes, but with the wider awareness that many were developing. They were like landmarks for people who were learning how to move through the folds of space and time, stable points in a landscape that was otherwise always changing. Constance found out that some of the dimensional tunnels did not go anywhere. To states of mind, not to real places. Going through these specific tunnels didn't change where you were, but it did change how you saw things, giving you direct access to ways of thinking and understanding that are usually too far away for the human mind to reach. They were quick ways to get to higher levels of consciousness that would normally take years of deep thought to reach. Eleanor and Constance would sometimes meet in the Great Hall to share what they had learned and plan their efforts. At those times, the bond between them was almost tangible, a harmonic resonance that made the air around them glow. They had grown beyond just being sisters and become something more, two parts of a larger consciousness that worked through them, using their unique forms to do work that no one consciousness could do alone. Summer storms swirled around the mansion in patterns that looked like they had been planned. Lightning drew complicated shapes in the sky, echoing the symbols that were on the mansion's walls and stone pillars. It was as if the weather was reacting to the changes in the dimensions, changing to reflect the new power structures that were spreading through the area. The network kept getting bigger, one point and one connection at a time. The CROWE mansion was still the beating heart of this growing network. It was where it all started and the place where the strongest currents flowed. The CROWE sisters were no longer just in charge of one portal. They were now the architects of a change that was quietly changing the very fabric of reality. The years flowed over the CROWE mansion like water over old stones. Each season adds a new layer of change. People thought of Eleanor and Constance as almost mythical, women who lived at the same time in more than one reality. Their bodies acted as anchors for minds that went far beyond the limits of normal bodies. The dimensional network they had helped wake up now throbbed with. A web of light had formed across the Appalachian region, connecting points that had previously been dormant. Only those with expanded perception could see it. The mansion was still the main hub, but other places had grown their own distinct traits and communities of dimensional explorers. Eleanor spent most of her time on the third floor, where she became more and more a part of the rotating structure. She could now see through many layers of reality at once, and her mind. Going through different dimensions like a river goes through different landscapes. It was hard to tell where Eleanor ended and the portal began at times, as if they had both become parts of a bigger whole. Constance kept exploring the depths, but now her trips took her to places that couldn't be found on any normal map. She walked through tunnels that were between moments in time and rooms that were in negative spaces in the universe's geometry. Every trip brought new pieces of old knowledge, like pieces of a puzzle that showed truths about the basic nature of life. The area around the mansion had changed into something completely new. It didn't follow normal rules or hierarchies. Instead, it worked through resonance and synchronicity. Decisions arose organically from the collective consciousness cultivated by all members, a mutual comprehension that made conventional authoritarian frameworks superfluous, the impossible. Gardens that Constance had grown in the underground rooms now grew fruits with amazing properties. They weren't just good for your body, they also fed other parts of life that are less obvious. Eating these fruits made consciousness expand for a short time, giving people direct access to the multidimensional geometries that make up what we think of as reality. Eleanor created ways to record dimensional experiences in crystals that had been specially prepared. These people could then use the crystals to directly experience Eleanor's explorations through the layers of reality. It was a type of education that went beyond traditional learning by not only giving information, but also giving direct, hands-on understanding. The rotating structure on the third floor had changed so much that it was hard to tell what it was. It now had features that changed from one moment to the next in response to the dimensional currents that flowed through it. It was a door and a mirror at the same time, a map, and a window. Its functions were so intertwined and overlapping that they couldn't be easily grouped. Constance found that the deepest chambers held not only records of the past, but also visions of the future. Because space was multidimensional at those depths, time didn't flow in a straight line. Instead, it existed in all of its possible forms at the same time. She learned how to deal with these time currents, looking into possibilities and probabilities like others look into new places. The rock, the pillars around the property had become aware of themselves in some way. They weren't conscious in the usual sense, but they did respond to and interact with people who came up to them, changing their resonance frequencies to make it easier for them to move between dimensions. They became active partners in the community's work, like living tools that grew and changed with the people who used them. Eleanor and Constance eventually figured out that their work was moving into a new stage. The network was back up and running. Pathways had been opened, and a new group of dimensional explorers was starting to appear. It was time to start putting together what they had learned so that it could be passed down to future generations and continue to grow. The CROWE Mansion was no longer just a building or even a doorway to another dimension. It had become a symbol, a real-life example of how to go beyond the limits of what seems to be real. And the CROWE sisters, who have been on an amazing journey since then. That far-off day when they got to the mountains, they became living legends, showing people who wanted to go beyond what was thought to be possible. The old folds of the West Virginia mountains hide many secrets, and the story of the CROWE sisters is one of the most mysterious. We don't know exactly what happened to Eleanor and Constance in the years that followed. All we know is that the mansion still stood in that impossible place between realities, making it impossible for anyone to find it. Comprehension. Some people say that the sisters eventually became one with the dimensions they had helped to open, becoming part of the multidimensional structure that filled the property. Their bodies would have just disappeared, turning into patterns of pure energy that kept moving through the mansion's hallways and the deep caves below. Some people say that they still walk through those impossible spaces, but only people who have learned how to see them can see them. Look past the surface of reality. People say that they are the eternal guardians of the portal they opened, making sure that dimensional currents flow smoothly and keeping chaotic forces from crossing in an uncontrolled way. According to the stories, the CROWE Mansion stood for decades, maybe even centuries, in its own strange flow of time. The circle of dead plants around it never closed, leaving a mark on the landscape that showed that something amazing had happened in that area. The stone pillars kept shining all the time, like beacons for those who knew how to see them. The group that had formed around the sisters eventually broke up, and each person took with them pieces of the knowledge they had learned. They spread out over the mountains and beyond. Some set up their own dimensional exploration points, while others just got used to their new, expanded consciousness and saw the world through lenses that showed its hidden depths. The dimensional. People who knew how to get around the tunnels that Constance had opened could still use them. People say that even today there are hidden paths in the Appalachian Mountains that lead to places that shouldn't exist, and that the laws of physics bend in ways that shouldn't happen. The rotating structure on the third floor, which was the heart of all change, kept dancing. Some stories say that it still spins even though the mansion itself has fallen apart. Now, existing only as pure geometry hanging between dimensions, a permanent doorway through which different realities keep mixing. The records from that time are broken and don't agree with each other, as if the events were too complex to be recorded in a clear way. Different witnesses told very different stories about the same events, as if each person had seen the story unfold through a slightly different layer of reality. The legacy of the CROWE sisters goes beyond any historical record. It is, not in documents or artifacts, but in the small changes they made to the way things really are. People who are sensitive enough can still feel the ripples their actions made. Echoes that keep spreading through dimensions, touching consciousness and opening up new possibilities. Some people say that the real change that Eleanor and Constance made was not in their bodies, but in how they saw things. They didn't change the world, but they changed how a few people could see it, showing layers that had always been there all along, but no one could see them. And maybe that's the most important lesson from their story. That reality is much bigger than what we can see and hear. The mountains in West Virginia still have secrets. Sometimes, people who are traveling say they see strange lights on the most remote slopes, or feel an unexplained presence in certain parts of the old forests. Are these echoes of the CROWE sisters, or is the human mind just putting patterns on things that happen in nature? Maybe the answer doesn't matter as much as the question. The story of the CROWE sisters reminds us that our understanding of the world has limits. Beyond those limits, there are possibilities that we can barely imagine. And maybe, just maybe, some of us have the vision and bravery to cross those lines, to look into the hidden depths of reality, and come back changed. If anything is left of the mansion today, it is still a mystery. Some brave people say they have found it, but it's hard to tell if they're talking about the same place because their descriptions are so different. Maybe the mansion only exists partially in this dimension, showing itself to each visitor in a different way. Or maybe it has completely disappeared, leaving only impressions in the structure of space. The CROWE sisters are still mysterious figures. They came to the mountains with unknown goals and did something that was beyond the understanding of their time. The story makes us question what is possible and think that reality might be much stranger and more amazing than we can imagine. And that brings us to the end of the story about the most dangerous aesthetic spaces in the mountains and in the parts of human consciousness that haven't been explored yet. The story doesn't really end. It just fades away into the mists of mystery, leaving you with more questions than answers. If you liked this trip through shadows and mysteries, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that take you to the most interesting and scary parts of your mind. Please leave a comment below about what part of this story interested you the most. Until the next trip.